here's an interesting thing. Two NATO powers, the United States and Turkey, are on two sides of the question. I doubt very much that they're coming back into the fight. This was a rout. I mean, Mr. Assad, this is an enormous strategic victory for Israel. Mr. Assad could have, called upon the country for a big renovation.
Question on this, Vijay, is the difficult question. On hindsight, how do you look at the Assad legacy? Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. If you are new to the show, please smash that subscribe button. Also consider joining our membership on YouTube or be a Patreon or just donate through the link in the description box. In either case, do watch the show, hit a like, share and comment. Without further ado, let me welcome our guest today, Vijay Prashad. Vijay is a historian and author, a journalist and a political commentator. Vijay, welcome back to India and Global Left.
Nice to be with you. Thanks.
I want to discuss Syria with you. Before I ask you further questions, can you just put out your opening statement? What has happened and what are its implications?
Well, in early December, the 53-year period of the Assad family is over. First, the father, Hafiz al-Assad, a tank commander, took power through effectively a military coup, leading the Syrian Ba'ath Party into office. And then after his death, he had assumed that his elder son would take over. His elder son, unfortunately, was not able to, for he died. Unfortunately, a pressure came on the younger son, Bashar al-Assad. I mean, he was a ophthalmologist. He was perfectly content with his life. He was training in London. I think he was the most reluctant president of Syria. He was drawn in when he came into Syria. In 2000, there was a conclave held, maybe mainly left and Republican, secular intellectuals from the petty bourgeoisie gathered together with something called the Damascus Spring. They wanted to have a greater say in the public sphere and so on. Initially, Bashar al-Assad, the young man, decided to allow this opening, and then he shut it down. That might have been actually a big error on his part, because in doing so, he sort of lost the section of the secular petty bourgeoisie and the left petty bourgeoisie from his the structure he was going to create. In 2011, there was a large uprising in Syria. It was taken advantage of by various powers in the region, particularly Turkey took advantage of it. Turkey has had its long-standing claims upon northern Syrian territory. The founder of the Ottoman Empire, Suleiman Shah, is buried in northern Syria. Turkey has long coveted that region. The Turks became the home of the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood, which is the pious section of the petty bourgeoisie. When this rebellion took place, Turkey playing this role, Al-Qaeda crossed the border from Iraq. The rebellion became quite fierce. Russia and Iran, as well as Hezbollah, came to the defense of the Assad government. This lasted for a better part of a decade. But then, because, to some extent of Israeli attacks on the Syrian military, on Hezbollah, on Iranian forces, because of Russia's war in Ukraine, these, allies of the Syrian government were constrained elsewhere, and Syrian army itself had been hit by the Israelis. And so the rebels just walked into Damascus effectively in early December, led by Hayat Tahrir al-Shams, which is, a group heavily helped by the United States, Turkey, Israel, and so on. Although they do have a mass base within Syria of Islamists who have been cultivated over the past 20 odd years.
Turkey's foreign minister recently visited Damascus and met al-Jolani. He's effectively the first foreign prime minister to do that, and he denounced the Syrian democratic forces, the Kurdish democratic forces, and he has called for the disbandment of the YPG, the Kurdish militia backed by the U.S., who is essentially effectively controls the northeastern part of Syria, and Turkey sees that as a great threat. Can you discuss a little bit of how you see is the implication of the HTS coming to power in northeast Turkey and the interest of the US in the region?
Well, firstly, it's important to recognize that since at least 2011, Turkey has been quite severely Balkanized. I'm sorry, Syria has been quite severely Balkanized. There really isn't one Syria, and so let's go over the map if that's okay, just to clarify for people. In northwestern Syria and in parts of central Syria, central North Syria, the Turkey effectively is in control. Turkey has taken over that part of the country. In fact, the city of Idlib, where Hayat Tahrir al-Shams and other groups, HTS and other groups, had been holed up, it was because of Turkey. Turkey provided military support, invaded Syria in 2020 to defend those forces. So that whole northern belt up to about north central Syria is in the hands of the Turks. Then, if you go further eastward from the Turkish-controlled area, there's an enclave controlled by the YPG, the Protection Services. The YPG is an organization of largely Syrian Kurds and others, assisted, in fact, created by the Kurdish Workers' Party, which is effectively a Turkish organization which the Turks proscribe. So does the United States. But nonetheless, the YPG, emerged in the middle of the melee of the civil war, largely as a front line against ISIS. And the reason for that was that the cities that the YPG and PKK controlled in northern Syria were along the route that ISIS took from Iraq to try to come to northwestern Syria. I mean, it just happened that they were on the road. So they were the front line. And as a consequence of being on the front line, and because of the US-Israeli links to Iraqi Kurds, the United States created the enclave of Iraqi Kurds in 1991 after the kind of stalled attack on Iraq at that period. They created an autonomous region in northern Iraq. Because of that close relationship with them, and that the YPG was a front line against ISIS, the United States came in to defend the YPG, gave them aerial support. This was around the time of the Battle of Kobane. They provided aerial support for them. So here's an interesting thing. Two NATO powers, the United States and Turkey, are on two sides of the question of what to do with the YPG, the PKK, the Kurds in northern Syria. Turkey wants them disbanded, wants that enclave broken down. The United States actually is pretty keen on allowing it to remain. Now, why is the United States keen on allowing it to remain? Just to the east of the Kurdish enclave, the United States actually controls quite a large swath of territory along the Iraqi border. There's a large US base there. This is the area of Syria's oil fields, which the US now controls. This area used to be ISIS territory. And when the US won it back from ISIS, it just stayed there. So now imagine from the northwestern border of Syria, out there near the Mediterranean Sea and the Turkish border, all along the top, right down along the Iraqi border, there's an L, which Damascus does not have any jurisdiction over. Then if you come further south, in 1973, the Israelis had seized the Golan Heights, which are adjacent to the, what Israel claims as its border, and adjacent to Lebanon. Well, once Mr. Jolani, well, in fact, let's go back. In 2011, when the when the protests began, the Israelis created a battalion called Battalion 210, whose express purpose was to be prepared and trained first to monitor the border, but secondly to do what they did this year. As soon as the Assad government fell, Battalion 210 crossed the line of control and seized the 1974 UN buffer zone and then went further. I mean, I have looked at this carefully. The Israelis have seized, as much territory perhaps as Gaza. That's a lot of area inside Syria. So Syria is already decidedly Balkanized. It's not a country and has not been for a very long time. So that's important to bear in mind. When the Turkish foreign minister comes to Damascus and says, well, take back what is, now held by the Kurds, that's easy to say, but Turkey is saying something that is also, unfortunately, going to probably be a reality for a long time because it sets up Turkey and the US into a clash. Hayat Tahrir al-Shams is beholden to both Turkey and the United States. Very unlikely they'll be able to solve that problem from Damascus. This is a US Turkey problem. And I would say that I think if I was the YPG, I wouldn't sleep well at night because each side is capable of betraying the other. And most likely the US is going to cut a deal with Turkey because it actually owes Turkey a lot for what has happened recently in the sense of weakening the adversaries of Israel. It owes Turkey a lot, and I think they might sell out the Kurds.
This reminds me of Iraq, in fact. I mean, effectively, a government that was weakened massively, like since the sanctions in 1991, and by 2003, because of that weakening, it was massively unpopular, not just among the Shia and the Kurds, but also among large sections of Sunni Muslim population and also his own Baath Party officials. The US walked in literally without a fight, and then this weak government, the US-backed coalition, couldn't control, and it by 2005 it effectively became a civil war between the Shia Sunnis and the Kurds. How much of a likelihood of a bloody infighting between the Kurds and the Jolani-controlled Damascus and the region nearby is likely?
I mean, firstly, the parallel is, I think, important and useful to look at the parallel with Iraq. But there are some differences. And, the differences are that, you don't actually have the United States in power in Damascus. Yeah. And that poses a difference because if the US had come into Damascus directly, or if the Turks had come into Damascus directly, or if a multinational force had come in, it would have awoken directly Syrian nationalism, forms of Syrian patriotism. Syria is exhausted. Syria has been under sanctions since at least 2003, when the US placed the Syria Accountability Act, on the country as a consequence of Syria allowing Iran to use Syrian territory to resupply Hezbollah. Syria has been exhausted by the sanctions policy, by the war since 2011, by the ceaseless bombardment, and so on. It is a country that is exhausted. It is, of course, the case that there are large sections of the population that may be relieved, that are relieved. That Hayat Tahrir al-Sham comes in, Mr. Jolani has been well coached. He takes off his Al-Qaeda-esque uniform. He puts on a kind of bland uniform, goes to the Umayyad Mosque, says things like, it's a new day for Syria, says that we will protect minorities and so on. In a sense, because he is one way or the other Syrian, the sting of patriotism that could have been awoken against him is not so powerful, and also the exhaustion of the Syrian Arab army, which, some sections of it have gone to Iraq. They went by truck along with parts of the leadership of the government. I doubt very much that they're coming back into the fight. This was a rout. I mean, Mr. Assad didn't make a statement before he left Damascus. He didn't even make a statement before he left Latakia. That was his first stop. And in fact, the statement that he did release from Moscow was more a self-justification than a statement saying we're going to fight another day. This is an alien invasion and so on. Saddam, on the other hand, made several statements. We're going to fight them and, we're going to erase them from Iraqi soil. So the whole sting of patriotism has been taken out of this. And I think that's important to register that you don't have a basis for that kind of general Syrian uprising against an invader. Secondly, we'll have to wait and see. I mean, this depends on a couple of factors. Will Mr. Jolani feel the need to move troops up to confront the Kurds? I don't think actually that's what the Turks were asking him to do. I think the Turks were asking him to give them permission to start squeezing the Kurds. They don't even need to do a frontal assault. They can start putting a siege on the Kurds. This is an old strategy. Cut off supplies. Make a deal with the Americans to passively cut off supplies. So there's no public, statement about this. So the Americans don't have to publicly once again betray the Kurds. That's a very bad alliance to have made for the YPG. They made it out of necessity. But, I mean, the US will drop you whenever it pleases. It's unlikely that the Turks are actually saying send the Hayat to Kobani. I don't think so. I think they're saying give us permission to squeeze them. I think that it all depends on how the Russian forces withdraw from Syria, whether they withdraw. They may still maintain some of their bases, but that is still in negotiation. I think there's a long wait and see period. There was some incidents already of violence against minorities, very poorly reported, but they already took place. But, I'm not sure that it is generalized as of now. So we'll have to wait and see. I mean, for the sake of Syria, I very much hope there is no sectarian violence. I mean, I hope, and I know this is a strange thing to say, but I hope in one measure, Mr. Jolani succeeds in not permitting violence against minorities. That is not something humans should ever cavalierly talk about. I also hope that Mr. Jolani is able to bring, some measure of security for people. Now, the questions that arise are, what does this mean for Israel's occupation of Syria? What does it mean for Turkey's or for the United States and so on? Are these going to continue in perpetuity? Is this the price of some security for Aleppo, Hama, Homs, and Damascus, maybe Dara, that you give up all these regions to foreign powers? That's a heavy price to pay.
Yeah, I think that the rejoinder is very important, that unlike in the case of Iraq, there is no direct occupation of Syria by the United States. I do still feel, though, there is one more parallel, which is the remarkable weakening of the state, which is more of a global south phenomena, which has happened everywhere, and the state's inability to employ people. And under that squeeze, its inability to tax large parts of the country, its inability to control essential industrial bases or, even oil, would leave you with very few government jobs. And in these parts of the countries where I remember reading Saddam Hussein's government's figure, where roughly about 1 million people were employed by the state itself out of 22, 23 million. It's a huge number. And then there is a greater chance of sectarianism, because then you include your own people and the others are felt left out. And obviously there is a long history of sectarianism in the region. So that was my sort of concern here. Can you, just react to that if you like, but then I also want to ask you a little bit on Israel. A lot of people have been talking about the strategic US and Israel interest in this. It's not very clear how Jolani is reacting to the renewed occupation of Syria by the Israeli forces. What do you think might be going on at that front?
Well, firstly, I'm a little afraid of what's happening. Let me explain what I mean by that. So, the Israelis understood that as they committed their genocide on the Palestinians, largely in Gaza, but also in the West Bank, they were given a blank check by the Europeans. I mean, I don't really care what the US thinks because the US is party to this genocide. They are not, a secondary power. They are arming the Israelis and so on. But the Europeans gave them a blank check. Okay, so having received a blank check and seeing public opinion inflame against Israeli actions, Mr. Netanyahu did something pretty interesting. He said that this is not Israel's confrontation against the Palestinians, the genocide, but this is part of Israel's war against Iran. That Hamas was being supplied by Iran, and it was important for Israel to weaken Iran. So then that gave him the justification in his eyes to bomb Beirut and go heavily after Hezbollah in the north, including invading southern Lebanon and so on. And in fact, in the middle of all that, assassinating Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah. Now, this did have a weakening impact on Hezbollah. And in order to wrap all this up, you weakened Hamas, you weakened Hezbollah. The next phase was to go after Syria. And so the Israelis began sustained bombing of Syrian military establishments, including bombing the intelligence building in Damascus, just bombing it's very underreported, but they just devastated the intelligence building in Damascus. I was interested in why they did that. There's lots of questions to be asked, but let's leave all that. The issue is they severely weakened the Syrian military forces. And they attacked the Iranians in two ways. They hit Iranian positions in Syria, including logistical depots, and they hit Iran within the boundaries of Tehran. They assassinated a Hamas leader, they assassinated Iranian generals. Iran responded, but it was mostly theatrical. Syria did not respond. Syria just sort of sat there and was mute while the Israelis just pummeled Syria consistently. This was interesting. It suggested to me that Syria just didn't have the capacity, that Mr. Assad was sitting largely on a Trojan horse here. It was empty. Trojan horse is not the metaphor, but he was sitting on an empty shell, because why didn't he, even retaliate mildly? Why didn't he allow the various factions to retaliate and say, it's not me, it's the factions? There was nothing really from the Syrian border. Very mild firing of rockets and so on, but nothing significant. I mean, Syrian military positions were attacked and they didn't respond. You can imagine the morale inside the Syrian military. And I think very cleverly, now, whether this was coordinated with the Turks and the United States or not is not relevant in a sense. It doesn't matter if they coordinated. In fact, de facto, there was a coordination, even if there wasn't actually some meeting somewhere. But because by weakening the Syrian military near Damascus and along Road M5 going down from Idlib to Damascus, by weakening Syrian military posts, it opened the doors to Hayat Tahrir al-Sham to just drive down the highway. It doesn't matter if there was an actual coordination. There was a de facto coordination. Israel actually provided, in my opinion, the air support for HTS to take Damascus. Now, having taken all this territory in western Syria, southwestern Syria, Mr. Jolani made a public statement saying that he is not going to confront Israel and not going to permit confrontation with Israel. This immediately suggests two things. Number one, HTS is not going to permit Iran to resupply Hezbollah through a land route. That is just not going to be allowed. That means Hezbollah is going to have a hard time getting resupplies. The US Navy has basically blockaded the Eastern Mediterranean. No Iranian ship can get in. Iranian aircraft will not be able to easily overfly Syria. It can't overfly Turkey. They're not going to permit it. So Hezbollah is basically weakened. It's going to have to fight with what it has. And also, it means that the various Iraqi factions that had been in Syria and the Syrian factions that existed, which were based, the Palestinian and pro-Palestinian groups, they cannot fight Israel on Syrian soil. So this is an enormous strategic victory for Israel. Now, every single one of Israel's borders is relatively secure. The border with Lebanon, the border with Syria, and then there's the peace treaty with Jordan and Egypt. Bam! The only adversary is Yemen, and the US and the Israelis have been hitting Yemen recently. I started by saying I fear this. I fear this because I fear the United States is building up to an attack on Iran. It's not necessary. You've already weakened Iran, but I fear that that's what they're building up to.
Can you talk about the implication in Mediterranean that you just mentioned? I'm thinking about Russia, which you haven't spoken a lot so far. Russia has important bases, the Al Khamim air bases, the Tartus naval base, which is like one of the few freshwater bases. I think they also have in Crimea. Um, do they still control those bases? What's going to happen in the future? And what's the implication of that on even Africa, where Russia had the Mediterranean was the link to Africa. So the Russia's influence in the region because of fall of Assad in Syria.
Well, for Russia, this was an important loss as well, a strategic loss. So, the fact that the United States has taken advantage of the genocide taking place to bring its large parts of its navy into both the Persian Gulf, where anyway it has been stationed in Qatar and so on, but also into the Eastern Mediterranean is significant. Russia is really a cold power. Most of its coastline is frozen in the winter. Most of its coastline. It had two very important warm water ports. One was Sevastopol in Crimea, and the second is Tartus in Syria. Now, if you think about it, when the US basically blockades the Eastern Mediterranean, it's blockaded both of Russia's warm water ports, regardless of whether Russia has to pull out of Tartus or not. Because the base in the Crimea is in the Black Sea. And to get to the rest of the world, Russian ships have to go through the Bosphorus, sailing past Istanbul to get out into the Mediterranean, where the US ships are. So in a sense, Russia has been held into the Black Sea and into Tartus. I don't know what arrangements they'll make with the US to allow Russian military vessels, out of the Black Sea through the Straits of Gibraltar into the Atlantic Ocean. They could hold them off. They could prevent it. It would be an international incident, but it's not impossible. So one are the ships, and that's an important issue. If they lose the base in Tartus, effectively, although climate change is changing things, there is Vladivostok and so on. The Isthmus of Irkutsk, the Russians could develop a big warm water base there if they need. And in fact, they might expand the shipping along that Japanese, the coastline near Japan of Russia. Irkutsk is a very large, that area is a big producer of natural gas and so on. So it might be propitious for the Russians to build something there. Anyway, but the question of Africa is significant. Let's leave the ships for a minute. The air base that the Russians had in Syria allowed them to refuel their military carriers going to the African continent, where they did provide supplies to some of the new governments, that have come to power. They did provide assistance to some of them. Now, having lost the airbase, most likely they will lose access to the airbase. They will have no landing rights anywhere. I mean, who's going to allow Russian military planes to land? The Greeks? No. The Italians? I doubt it. The Iraqis? Unlikely, maybe, but unlikely. I don't think they want to fly into Sana'a. That's a very long flight. I mean, these are serious geostrategic problems that are a consequence of this. Now, that's okay. The countries in Africa that had been getting supplies from the Russians will find their own way. These are really important new rebellions on the African continent. They're not reliant upon Russian support, but it will be a loss and they'll have to find substitutes for Russian assistance.
What are the countries where Russia is involved? Is it Burkina Faso, Niger, Mali?
Yeah, the Alliance for Sahel states are some, but not only. There are other countries. I mean, Russia has a forward position in several countries on the continent where it provides, various kinds of assistance and aid, machines, some military aid, and so on. These countries have been cut off from the world. So they are also, cleverly playing the angles against geopolitics. They are not going to fall into the trap of saying we reject everybody. They are playing the angles and they need assistance. And having received the assistance, they are grateful for it. Russia has played a role, but it's really going to be difficult for that to continue.
I want to ask you a little bit about the impact of this on the Gulf countries, and there was a report in the Financial Times after the fall of the government, which says that Iran partly decided to not back Syria because it was seeing Assad slowly moving away from Iran and causing up to the Gulf monarchs because it was opening up, liberalizing its economy. It desperately needed private capital, which was being supplied by some of these Gulf countries, and that essentially created a Gulf. The Financial Times interviewed some of the Iranian officials and some unnamed Syrian government affiliates. The Gulf countries have always wanted or desired Syria to come back to the Arab League in a way and move away from Iran. What do you think would be some of the feelings in the Gulf regarding this?
I mean, it's interesting. Who knows? These things may be true. This is part of what one would call high politics. Yeah. But I find it a little unlikely because for Iran, the relationship with Hezbollah was such a key relationship that Iran would have done almost anything to have allowed Hezbollah to survive. It's not just a military or, there's really two or three reasons why the relationship between Iran and Hezbollah is so important. Number one is that they are both deeply committed to the Palestinian cause, which doesn't actually bring them any personal, national self-interest. I mean, if Iran was looking at this from a strictly national self-interest position, Iran would have stopped supporting the Palestinian cause a long time ago. But Iran is politically committed to it, and Hezbollah politically committed to the liberation of the Palestinians. And so this was a very close relationship on that score. Secondly, people don't understand the very close relationship between Iraq's Shia community, and the Shia community in southern Lebanon. These are communities that marry across long borders. These are communities that go from Lebanon to train in the halakas of Iraq, the great Shia establishments, and the Iraqi Shia establishments are, of course, very closely tied to Iran because the Iranian clerics also come and train in Iraq. Iraq is really the crucible of old Shiism. Of course, there are places in Iran that are very important. And during the Iran-Iraq war, Iran developed its own importance in places of training and so on. But the great historical, spaces are there in Iraq. And And I think we just can't underestimate those relationships, those emotional, intimate relationships between the Shiites of Lebanon, Iraq, and Iran. This is like India has an enormously large Shiite population, doesn't have the same relationship to Lebanon. It's too remote. People don't marry from Lucknow, to Nabatea. It doesn't happen. But from southern Iraq or from Baghdad, people marry with Nabatea, with Saida, even, the elites of the Shiite community. So second is this intimate, close relationship. And thirdly, and I want to just say this very, very clearly, Syed Hassan Nasrallah was considered to be an extraordinary man, like a emulatable extraordinary man. When he was assassinated, Shiite establishments in Syria, in Iraq, in Iran flew the black flag of mourning on top of their establishments. This is very unusual. As far as my friends tell me, when Ayatollah Khomeini died, there was not such generalized mourning. At least that's what my friends tell me. And I doubt that the Iranians would just throw out, just dismiss Hezbollah at its needs right after the assassination of Syed Hassan Nasrallah. I mean, the Iranian foreign minister met with Assad and urged him to put up a greater fight against Hayat Tahrir al-Shams. And he said, no, it's a strategic retreat and so on. I mean, things happened so fast within less than a fortnight. I mean, what were the Iranians or Russians supposed to do? Fly in people from Tehran? That was not going to be possible, not in such a short notice. And then by the time everything collapsed, you had to come to terms with the situation. You can't then bring in troops, to try to take back Damascus. The fact that the Republican Guard and others didn't even put up a stand against HTS around Damascus is telling. What can you don't want the Iranians to defend Damascus. Then it's a foreign intervention. If your own army can't do it, how can the Iranians send troops to do that? That's an elementary thing about, putting up a perimeter, blocking the road. Nothing was done. They just drove right in.
One of the things that confuses me a little bit is the situation in 2016 when Assad, or 2017, 2018, when he gained an upper hand, and even in 2020 where that kind of a deal was struck with Turkey's involvement and then Russia and Iran agreeing to it, which was a kind of freezing the conflict for a while. The Syria looked weak, but it didn't look as weak. Of course, the sanctions has been there for so long. Have you been able to wrap your head around what happened in these kind of quiet years? And by quiet, I mean the media completely ignoring what was going on. What happened since 2020 that weakened Assad so much?
Well, one is that, after having boxed in the various rebel groups in the city of Idlib, twice the Syrian Arab army tried to move on them, twice the Turks forbade it. So that's one. They sort of incubated their strength in Idlib. Secondly, unfortunately, the Syrian government didn't reconstruct the Syrian Arab army. It had taken enormous losses between 2012, particularly, and 2018, 2019, enormous losses. And there was no restructuring of the military forces. What one could have done was one could have done an assessment of where the greatest hemorrhaging had taken place, shored up the troops, put in place really much more professional, leaders rather than family members who could be trusted and so on. Cracked down on corruption, built up the morale of the troops and so on. None of that was actually done. The military was sort of bathed in demoralization and corruption. And that's not really the way to go. I mean, that's exactly what had happened in military forces in places like Libya, where the military was already demoralized before the uprising of 2011. In the last years of the first decade of the 21st century, the Libyan government had completely ignored the military. They were focused on big new projects, that were going to help the country, which were important. But you have to still, you have to tend to your military if you're going to have a military. You have to worry about external invaders and so on. These are all real facts in that part of the world. But if you're not, building its morale, how is it going to? Why should it fight for you? People will just throw the gun on the ground and go home. And that's effectively what happened. I mean, between demoralization and corruption, the military was hollowed out. And I put this, at the government's feet. They didn't do a renovation. I mean, after 2015, 2016, after the Russian intervention, Mr. Assad could have, called upon the country for a big renovation. Now that the civil war has tampered down, let's begin to talk about how to, what is the Syrian project? I mean, despite sanctions, despite all of that, use the Iranian presence, use the right to train up a military. Well, what happened was that the Russians came in, and rather than train the military, they also wanted to have operational control of things. And this created a problem in the chain of command, that you had Russians, Iranians, and others, and the chain of command began to wither. So there's a, when you go back and look at it, there'll be a million things people can write about the weakening and so on, lessons to be learned. But in effect, it's a little late now. The military has been demoralized and apparently gone home. Now, it could be like Iraq, that 2 weeks from now, after Christmas, there's an insurgency that develops of the old military that, was incubated. But I somehow doubt it. I feel like right now, the minority populations are so scared of a pogrom that they don't want to risk it by taking the gun, because they are minority. They are much smaller publics. They are afraid. They would like to cut a deal rather than, go on a military offensive to defend themselves. I mean, they may be trying to protect themselves, arming themselves, training and so on. But I doubt that they'll start an insurgency to take back Damascus. I don't think that's going to happen.
Also, my own assessment here, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, I feel like the minorities in Syria is much weaker than what was the case in Iraq, because even during Saddam's time, the Kurdish effectively controlled their own place in the northwest, and the Shia population in Iraq is huge, maybe 60%, had huge support from Iran. All of that is not the case here, even though the U.S. still backs the Kurds here, but I think the Druze and the Christians and the Shia in Syria is much weaker. What are your thoughts about the sentiment in these spheres? Because there is a lot of jubilation, celebration, the idea of new Syria now being talked about, which the Brits and the Americans constantly used to say after its Iraq invasion. But there is not too much being reported about feelings of within the minority circles. Do you have any idea about what they think about these events?
Well, I mean, it's all anecdotal, okay? People I know, people I talk to, people that send messages and so on. It's all anecdotal. So very hard to put together. I mean, basically, I would like to say that right now we don't have a lot of public statements coming from different communities as such. The only thing is Mr. Jolani had met Walid Jumblat, who's, the leader of the Druze in Lebanon, effectively the leader of the mountain Druze, even in Syria. And that meeting is significant. It's a peace deal between the Druze and Mr. Jolani. The Druze communities have historically, for whatever reason, also made agreements and deals with the Israelis. They have, up there in the Golan and adjacent mountain communities, there are Druze villages. they will find a way to make a deal. Mr. Walid Jumblat is a genius at this. He's been a survivor for decades. Ever since the Lebanese civil war, Mr. Jumblat has wound a way to protect the Druze community. To his credit, I mean, it's a minority community that lives in between clashing groups, and he's found a way. He was on the left, he was on the right, he was with Mr. Assad. He's now meeting Mr. Jolani. He's a survivor. Some people will call him an opportunist, but I mean, I can see his position. He's the leadership of a community that's under threat, so he protects them how he does. Christian communities, I think, will seek protection from, you know, I suppose that the United States will not allow Mr. Jolani to go and ethnically cleanse the Christian populations in the Kalamun region and so on. I mean, Al Qaeda before went and attacked those Christian villages, but I think the US will provide some guidance saying, look, you can't touch them. The question comes down to the Alawites that are along the Mediterranean coastline in Damascus and so on. I think they will seek also to make some sort of agreement with the Jolani government. I just, there's no way. It is a minority of minorities. If you add up Syria's minority populations, it's still not near half the population. So this is a minority of minorities. It's just that by accident of history, tank commander Hafiz al-Assad hailed from the Alawite community. That's an accident of history. That was not an Alawite coup. The Alawites didn't conduct a coup. It was Mr. Hafiz al-Assad who did it. He betrayed some of his colleagues and took power of the state, and then brought some of his family members and so on. It's very wrong to call the Assad government an Alawite government. It was an Assad government with family members and so on. And they protected the Alawite community for sure. And, nepotisms and things play a role. But I just don't see it. I think that the issue of self-preservation is going to come into play. Groups like the Kurds, the Alawites, and so on are going to fight to preserve themselves. And they will cut deals with all kinds of people. I doubt that they wouldn't. I mean, there are the Armenian population in Aleppo and so on. These are the populations that had fled the Armenian genocide in the Ottoman Empire, fled down to places like Aleppo. Some historical communities in Aleppo. I fear for Syria's culture quite a lot, because in Idlib, for instance, the government banned music. Syria is the home of the great Makam music. All kinds of musical traditions. I very much hope that this experience in Idlib is not carried forward to other cities. The liveliness of Syrian culture can get snuffed out. But I very much hope that's not the case.
Also, perhaps the HTS also, now that they have gained power, they also need, let's say, the Alawites as much as the Alawites need them, because they have traditionally held capital. There's a long history since the French occupation, how the Alawites have been in business. They are very important if you are to rebuild Syria. They control a large section of business that goes into Syria, and so on and so forth. My final question on this, Vijay, is the difficult question. On hindsight, how do you look at the Assad legacy? There is a Western view and, let's say, human rights view, which says that it was a 5 decade of a dynasty of monstrosity and all kinds of human rights. Then there is one view, much more nuanced, on the left, but also those who are against imperialism, which says that despite everything, Assad stood with the axis of resistance, never mind how active he was, but he was never against the Palestinian people. He was also against imperialism, and finally he was not sectarian. He had a secular commitment. What's your assessment looking back at the Assad family?
I mean, it really is a little soon to tell because there's a lot to be understood. Obviously, I think the caricature that this is like a cabinet of monstrosities is in error. I mean, if tomorrow the U.S. government fell and the prisons were opened up, you'd find mostly black and Hispanic, Latino political prisoners sitting in those jails. Would we walk through high security supermax prisons and release Mubi Abu Jamal and release Leonard Peltier and then say, look, this is a cabinet of monstrosities? Well, all kinds of states have hideous forms of prisons, and they all seem to have political prisoners. I don't know of any state project that's able to not have political prisoners. That's the nature of these transitional forms of states that we have. They have this kind of thing. So I think to use that one prison in Syria, which was, of course, hideous, and I've had friends who've been in the Assad's jails and so on, hideous, thing that can't define the entire legacy of 53 years. I mean, I think that's a trivial way to approach this. However much one says, well, it's condemnable that so many people, many of them innocent, were thrown in prison. That's not enough to define a legacy. At the same time, the Assad legacy is checkered. You may know that in 1991, when the United States went to war against Iraq, the Syrian government joined the US in bombing Iraq because they had historical animosity between the two factions of the Ba'ath. It's not always been an anti-imperialist government. It has its own histories. It has not always defended the Palestinians. It has its own histories. During the uprising, the Palestinian neighborhood of Yarmouk was devastated. So it's not a one. It's trivial to look at it as black and white. It's a very complicated story. But on balance, it's true that at least over the last 20 years, this government of Bashar al-Assad has provided Hezbollah with the ability to strengthen itself and therefore defeat the Israelis in the 2006 war because they could get supplied through Syria. I think that's very important for people to remember. I think it is also true that the Syrian government, by and large, has been far more secular than any of the sectarian governments in the region, far more committed to minority populations. That's true. But it's not the case that it was always doing things that one would defend. For instance, it opened up its economy to Turkish capital, which weakened the small business people who turned against the government in 2011. When there was a big drought in northern Syria, the government was not able to effectively deal with people struggling in the drought. These people moved to the cities, and who was there to tend to them? Saudi-trained clerics who gave social support. So-called Saudi civil society was built up in cities like Idlib and Aleppo. Why did they allow the Sunni clerics to go train in Saudi Arabia? These are all issues that, in balance, when a good balanced book is written about the Assad period, from 1970 to 2024, that will have to take into account these complexities. But again, by and large, the Syrian government certainly did stand to defend the right of Hezbollah, to be a defensive force against Israeli aggression. The Syrian government did provide a sanctuary for Palestinian factions in Damascus. The Syrian government did maintain order for minorities and so on. I mean, it's as I say, it's complicated, but on balance, yes. I disagree with both the Western storyline and with the great defenders, of the Assad government, who I think are not able to understand its own limitations. There's a difference between when one felt the need to say, look, I don't want the government to fall because what will come next is catastrophe. And once the government has fallen, I think misleadingly saying it had no problems. I think, as an assessment, I think now the door is much more widely open to make a fundamentally straightforward assessment of the Assad government.
I know time is short. If we can conclude with your recent dossier that you have put out in Tricontinental, titled "How Neoliberalism Has Wielded Corruption to Private Life in Africa." Please comment on what were your findings. I particularly liked one piece of statistics where, after you analyze that the whole Transparency International business on corruption has effectively led an assault on the public sector's corruption while completely giving leeway to the private sector to extract capital out of it. And the statistics that I found very interesting was that in Europe, effectively, like 1/5 of the workforce is within the public sector, while in Africa, it's 2.3% in Mali, 3.5% in Nigeria, and 6.7% in Zambia. Can you talk a little bit about that dossier and conclude?
Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned something about it earlier when you talked about states in the global south being weakened, and in the case of Syria, through sanctions and through the stealing of territory and the theft of its oil, initially by ISIS and then the US, these weaken the state. But of course, you don't need war to weaken states. States get weakened by IMF demands upon the state. You can't borrow money unless you cut your public wage bill and so on. And the moment you cut your public wage bill, the middle class migrates out, you lose a lot of skills, and the country begins to desiccate. That's exactly what we talked about. Is corruption the main problem in societies like Zambia? Of course, corruption plays a role in weakening the fiber of a country, but that's not the main problem. I mean, corruption grows when the state is desiccated, because then corruption becomes institutionalized. And that's what we go over. I don't want to give the game away. I'd like people to go and read the text, but it is in fact related to what we're talking about here. What's the biggest, most corrupt companies in the world? The arms industry. The arms industry benefits when there's a war. The arms industry has benefited from the war in Ukraine, benefited from the war, the genocide in Gaza, benefited. That's corruption. They corrupt society. They corrupt, human relations. We have to see it like that. Somebody giving somebody a small bribe is, inexcusable, but it's not the same scale as the kind of bribes paid by arms companies, the kickbacks and so on, that structure the arms companies. Claire Short, who was a minister in Tony Blair's cabinet, once said that, if arms deals are about bribes, why not skip the arms, just pay the bribe? I think she's right. Why deliver the weapons? Just do the bribes, man. That's all it is. It's actually a bribes industry in many countries. It's not an arms industry because the arms are never used. Countries buy arms for inflated costs, and the arms industry pays bribes to the government officials for the deal. Forget the arms, just do the bribe.
That was Vijay Prashad, journalist, commentator, and historian, joining India and Global Left. Thank you so much, Vijay.
Thanks a lot.
All right.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have two requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.